Why due diligence? Why is it so important to conduct it? What can go wrong?
So, I mean, HOAs are one thing that I can just think of off the top of my head of people overlooking sometimes. So HOAs, someone saying something's not an HOA, it's going to be drastically different selling a piece of land in rural America in an HOA versus not in an HOA. Speed and usually the amount you can sell it for as well. That's a very common thing. So you can imagine just something like not finding out if it's an HOA, it can cost you 30, 40% of your return on investment and cost you months and months because they're extremely difficult to sell.
And HOAs are very individual. Like you can find comps that make your property look very good outside of HOAs in rural America, whatever it is. And then all of a sudden your property's in HOA and you can't put mobile homes or whatever the situation is. It shrinks your buying pool down. And although the comps may look good, you want to find comps inside the HOA. That's a huge one. That's massive because some HOAs are very, very not desirable compared to just vacant, unrestricted land. So that's one of the first things we look at because not all HOAs are bad. A lot of people get this thing when we say all HOAs are bad. It's the more highly restrictive ones, the ones that are 80% vacant, not filled. They're 80% vacant for a reason. The subdivision was done in 1990. It still hasn't filled up. There's only 20 lots out of 200 of them filled, Ron. That's a sign that it's not desirable. Those are the type of things we look at with HOAs, but there's some other things we look at in due diligence. Let's talk about the basics. Like, what are some of the basics we're looking at in due diligence?
Yeah, so basics are, so we talked about the land. So when we looked at the land with our Discord question, that was basically what tools we use. I said MapRight, ID.land is what it's now called. And that's telling us floodplain, wetlands, slope is a big one. Slope is one that's very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to be 100% sure of on the computer. So that's where some people can go wrong. Computer might say it's not as bad as slope. You don't get boots on the ground before that. And then you buy the property and you see that it's straight up a hill or something like that. And then the other ones, like when you call the county and you have zoning restrictions, whether it's mobile home lots, city limits, Dan, is one that you'll see a lot. Yeah. So if you're in city limits, a lot of times it's more difficult to sell land because more restrictions, more taxes a lot of times. So that is one thing where you got to keep in mind. Even these tiny little cities that you wouldn't think would have restrictions, have restrictions. Almost and it can be so difficult to sell in the price. Again, similar to an HOA, I think, though.
It's very, very similar to an HOA. But then you can't hunt a lot of times in city limits. You can't do certain things like city limits. Depending on the city, has been one of the biggest deterrents of just buying and selling land, I think. Like it just acts, like you said, just like an HOA. But like flipping versus wholesaling, Ron, there's risk versus reward. We're doing all this due diligence up front, conducting it so we can buy it. We're minimizing the risk so that we can buy the property. There's a lot of people who try to wholesale land, and I get probably 20 of these a week from people trying to wholesale that are trying to get me to buy their land. They do no due diligence. They're just trying to wholesale it real quick. There's no risk on them, and that's why the reward's smaller too. We're doing all of our due diligence, getting the drone shots, doing all the things that Ron's talking about, checking if it's in a HOA, subdivision, getting all the restrictions, all the information up front, and then putting that risk bundle together and then acquiring it. Versus a lot of people like to wholesale, but they're not doing the due diligence up front, which doesn't matter. I think still it's more sustainable to do the due diligence because whoever you're selling it to is going to have those questions, but it's not as necessary. And I want to kind of make the difference because if you're not buying the property, there's no risk. Therefore, we're doing all this due diligence because we're buying it ultimately.
Yeah, I think it's a combination. Like with wholesalers, like you make more money when you buy the property, one, because of risk, and two, because it's just lack of knowledge at the end of the day. People wholesale land because they have no idea what it's going to sell for. So let's try to market this out to the masses and see what happens.
Yeah.
But yeah, that for sure. Like doing the due diligence is so valuable in this stuff. And 95% of the time, we're going to be within 10 to 15% of what our expected sales price is. And when we're buying at 35, 45% of market value, there is so much margin in there to undercut the market. But like we've talked about, like this entire episode is, you get seriously burned when either you buy for too high and you get burned, or you just get burned in general. You didn't do your wetlands due diligence. You didn't get boots on the ground. You didn't look at the slope. You don't know HOA. You don't know city restrictions. Those are like the common things where you can get burned.
As always, thank you for joining. Please do us a huge favor and like and subscribe our YouTube channel and share this with a friend. It really means the world to Ron and I, but more importantly, it could help change the life of someone else. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next episode.